Listen up, you primitive screwheads, and welcome to the second episode of Tales from the Cabin, where we look at a movie or season from Evil Dead and look at how it got adapted into Evil Dead the game. Today we'll be jumping headfirst into probably the definitive Evil Dead movie, the one that set the trend for the franchise's direction and tone, Evil Dead 2. Released in 1987, Evil Dead 2 is proof that when you're in the process of making a single breakout success into a franchise that shapes the culture, the second film is typically more impactful than the first. Shrek 2, Saw 2, John Wick 2, Terminator 2, Aliens. Let's just forget this one. And Evil Dead 2 absolutely fits this trend. And after the breakout success of the first movie, Sam Raimi was given a much higher budget for Evil Dead 2, which he started scripting with childhood friend Scott Spiegel in 1984. Spiegel was behind the more comedic tone of the sequel, which was originally meant to take Ash through a time portal to the Middle Ages before producer Dion De Laurentiis requested it be more similar to the original movie. Between that and the legal problems that prevented Raimi and Renaissance Pictures from using footage from their own original film, Evil Dead 2 had a somewhat difficult production, even if it wasn't actively hazardous to be on set like the first film. Nevertheless, Evil Dead 2 was a standout success that introduced not just the comedic tone that the series would be known for, but many names, images and plot elements that would become staples of the franchise going forward. The chainsaw and boomstick, the names Necronomicon and Deadite, and the journey of its main character Ash Williams from a scared teenager into a skilled, if reluctant, slayer of the undead and wisecracking action hero.
Groovy.
It stands to reason that probably the most impactful piece of Evil Dead media ever would be represented extensively in Evil Dead the game, and I guess you'd be right to think so. The game's dark comedy tone is the first thing you'll notice that points to this. Many of the characters from more humourless entries in the franchise, like the original Evil Dead or its remake, have a bit more bite and snark in their dialogue than they do in their home entries. The executions harken more to the spectacular and over-the-top violence in Evil Dead 2 than they do to the more desperate and grisly violence of the original film. Evil Dead the game features a clutch of returning characters from Evil Dead 2. Although, unlike the first movie, relatively few of the original cast reprise their roles for the game. Evil Dead 2 brought us Annie Knowby, Ed Getley, and that movie's version of Ash Williams, this time in the Hunter role. Only 3 survivors makes it the lowest turnout of any entry in the franchise, excluding the late arrival 2013 remake of Evil Dead. But it also gave us our first and oldest demon, Henrietta Knowby, known in game as the Warlord. Before we go any further, I just want to remind everybody that this video is liable to get copyright claimed because the clips that I take from both the films and the show when making these videos. And even if it doesn't, I'm still trying to earn ad revenue on this video in January, which is content creator hell. So I hope you understand when I say that if you've ever and ahhed about supporting me on Patreon before, then now would be the perfect time of year to do it. Patrons get early access to all my videos, get their name in the credits, and get access to my special Patreon exclusive Discord channel, so I will never expect or demand anything from my audience. I make this because I love it and because you guys enjoy it, but times like now are why Patreon exists. So if you are interested, then please do check it out, link is in the description. Let's start with probably the most competent character in any of the Evil Dead movies, Annie Knowby. Played in Evil Dead 2 by Sarah Berry, Annie is the daughter of Professor Raymond Knowby and a fellow archaeologist who specialises in ancient languages. After assisting with the recovery of the Necronomicon Ex Mortis from Castle Kandar, Annie journeys with her boyfriend Ed Getley to the Knowby cabin to check in with her parents. When they arrive at the Knowby cabin, they find a gibbering and insane man with one hand brandishing her father's shotgun. And the rest, they say, is history. Annie is set up as the final girl of Evil Dead 2, being the only character to make it into the third act without being killed or possessed, and bring a level of expertise with the nature of the demonic threat that no character has had before. And while she does kick the bucket at the end, she goes out swinging, and is behind the banishment of the Kandarian demon from our world. At least, until Ash gets high and summons it again 30 years later. Interestingly, Annie is kind of the range specialist of the leader role, and yet never wields a gun in Evil Dead 2. But I think it's excusable, since she never really gets stuck in up close like the others do, and prefers to remain distant from the danger while deciding the next move for the group. Annie is smart, resourceful, and wise enough to defer to the experience of others when she knows she's out of her depth. She's the dictionary definition of a good leader, and Evil Dead the game making her one fits like a glove. Which brings us to Annie's, ill-fated boyfriend, Associate Professor and unofficial red shirt Ed Getley. Ed is probably the side characteriest side character ever to side character. He does very little in Evil Dead 2, except get possessed to prove to the others that the Kandarian demon is real and only Ash is capable of fighting it. To the point that Ash basically hijacked his role as Annie's love interest by the end of the movie. When Saber decided to add Ed to the cast, they basically had nothing to work with in terms of an existing character. So they decided to Yoichi Tech, and just create their own character for him from the ground up. While he's never implied to be malicious in any way, Ed is presented as a bit of an egotistical prick, who's always looking out for himself and loves to show off. This loud and kind of boorish persona is a massive shake-up from the way he's presented in Evil Dead 2, where he more or less fades into the background for the few minutes he exists on camera before getting possessed. The game's version of Ed seems to be intelligent, as an associate professor of ancient history probably should be, but loves to show off his prowess, and I think his unique skills reflect that pretty okay. His weapon mastery, the crossbow, is perfect for someone like him. It's old-fashioned, fitting a history professor, and using one effectively is a skill the average Joe doesn't have, and would certainly be something Ed would be keen to show off. It's archaic and impressive. Two things that fit this game's interpretation of Ed to a T. Ed's weapon RNG passive, the Collector, also fits this in a roundabout sort of way. It's natural that the group show-up would have the highest quality gear available to flex on his colleagues. The active skill that lets him disable the demon's traps I think is the only skill that's somewhat reflected in the movie though. From the get-go he's skeptical of Ash and cautious of what's going on at the cabin, so the ability to preemptively deal with scare traps if he's cautious works, even if it didn't do him any good in the movie. On Ed's inclusion, Saber always had a bit of an uphill battle to turn the most generic guy in Evil Dead 2 into a character you might actually want to play. I think they did a pretty good job with it, even if people still confuse him with Scotty from time to time. One of the big reasons Evil Dead 2 sidelines Ed, however, is because of the last character in our Evil Dead 2 survivor lineup, Ash Williams, this time in the Hunter role. Voiced by Evil Dead 2's only returning actor, the indispensable Bruce Campbell, this version of Ash is probably the most immediately recognisable, and is the youngest Ash capable of using the chainsaw, since Evil Dead 2 is the movie where Ash cuts his hand off and replaces it with the chainsaw attachment. Interestingly, Evil Dead 2's Ash is the only one who doesn't have some sort of replacement for his missing hand when he isn't using the chainsaw in the game. Army of Darkness Ash has his tricked out Night Gauntlet, and Ash vs Evil Dead Ash has the Power Glove converted into a bionic hand by Pablo. But Evil Dead 2 Ash just kind of respawns his biological hand when it's not replaced by the chainsaw, which I guess makes sense because he's not missing his hand for the entirety of Evil Dead 2, but does look kind of strange at times. Especially since he wields the boomstick in one hand even though his other one is in perfect working order. Come on Saber, let us see the stump! The voice lines characterise Evil Dead 2 Ash in his midpoint, between the cowering and desperate young man Ash is in the first Evil Dead, and the brash, flippant, wisecracking Deadite Slayer he becomes in Army of Darkness in the TV show. He's clearly been hardened by his experiences so far at the cabin, which fits with his relationships with the other characters in the movie. Unlike everybody else at the cabin, Ash has dealt with the evil before, and is pushed into the role of the unlikely saviour, as the others get picked off around him. Evil Dead 2 Ash's voice lines bring that confidence to light. He's a man who's had enough of evil shoving him around, and is ready to fight back not just to survive, but to give the middle finger to everything trying to kill him. His skills fit this belligerent and resourceful survivalist idea very well. His looting passive works with this new Ash's low maintenance improvisation skills, making use of whatever's available to fight against evil however he can. This is the Ash that cut off his own hand with a chainsaw to survive, trapped it in a bucket, and turned the chainsaw into an attachment for his stump hand. He's not book smart per se, but he is great in a crisis, and will always find something to lend a hand, no pun intended. His active skill exorcism comes from one of the weirder ideas from Evil Dead 2 that mostly got dropped from this series after this movie. The idea that someone can be depossessed by the Kandarian demon and recover safely. At the very start of the movie, Ash's possession is removed by the sunlight on his skin, and later when the Kandarian demon possesses him again, he effectively forces it out of his body when he's reminded of the necklace he gave to Linda and what she meant to him. Exorcism is the closest we've got to that happening in the game, although crucially, Ash can't depossess himself. Meaning ironically, the demon's encouraged to possess him instead of the others, just like it does in the movie. And the Del Barrel skills, it's basically never seen out of his hands. Well, hand in the movie, and it's his weapon of choice for the movie's entire runtime, so it makes total sense that he should specialise in its use. This extends to his role in the roster as a hunter, since hunters are meant to be solo survivalists who keep out of danger from a distance and don't have the broad take on close encounters like Ash would do in later installments. With only 3 survivors from Evil Dead 2 in the roster, that leaves the last character to cover as the demon from Evil Dead 2, Professor Raymond Knowby's wife and Annie's mother, Henrietta, otherwise known as the Warlord. Henrietta marks the first character in the series to be introduced as a Deadite, instead of someone possessed by the Kandarian demon during the film's runtime. This required her to be used very differently than other Deadite-possessed victims thus far. The horror of seeing characters like Linda, Cheryl and Scotty possessed wasn't just that their friends had to watch them die, but had to kill them again to save their own lives. But aside from Annie, nobody else in that cabin ever knew Henrietta before, so that horrifying kill your friend dynamic just doesn't exist this time round. Henrietta had to be made scary in very different ways. For starters, she's introduced originally as kind of a new breed of Deadite. Someone capable of absolutely messing you up if you're not prepared, and even Ash struggles with her. When he's thrown into the fruit cellar by the others and barely makes out alive by the skin of his teeth, he finds himself utterly incapable of fending her off. Everything from her iconic and comically bloody kill on Jake, to her more monstrous and corpse-like appearance compared to the other Deadites, establishes Henrietta as a threat unlike any other, which translated really well to Evil Dead the game. The game's version of Henrietta Knowby is a boss unit capable of taking down whole teams of survivors if they're unprepared for her, and kind of fills the trapper slot of generic starter character for the demon side. She's mechanically simple, big, strong and tough, which fits with her relentless menace in Evil Dead 2. And her sheer disgustingness becomes a formidable weapon in and of itself. I suspect this part of her character and ability design comes more from her character's return in Ash vs Evil Dead Season 2, which focuses more on her gross out humour and plays up how revolting she is in her debut appearance. During the filming of Evil Dead 2, the fat suit and heavy makeup that Lou Hancock wore to play Henrietta caused some, let's say, hygiene issues on set. Under the heat and exertion, Hancock putted buckets inside the suit, especially for the action scenes, and the white fluid you can see leaking from the suit in some scenes isn't a special effect. It's Hancock sweat that built up over the course of filming that leaked out of the suit and mixed with the powder that was used to wear and remove the suit. I'm sorry, but that is the grossest thing to happen on the set of any Evil Dead movie, and I'd be surprised if it didn't have anything to do with the heightened use of gross out humour when Henrietta came back in the TV show, played this time by Ted Raimi. For what it's worth, her role in the game really plays up that disgusting angle, with her deadly fart attack, her sickly choked voice by Fred Tatasciore, and her, shall we say, intimate grab attack taken right from the show. One part I'm a bit surprised we didn't see is a transformation that she gets both in the show and in the original movie. When Ash proves too hard to take down, her head grows into a big monster head with a long neck for the rest of the fight. This seems like the ideal mechanic to give to a boss. Her Dark Souls-esque second health bar cropping up kind of similar to the Witch's Resurrection mechanic, but instead they just gave her a body slam that does not a lot of damage and takes 1,000 years to wind up. It just feels so underwhelming. I think this is the only issue with Henrietta though. Everything else absolutely rocks. In honour of being the oldest boss in the game, Henrietta is designed to be intentionally generic, as the original Deadite boss, to which the others are reimaginings on the formula. As such, it's fitting. The original boss gets the original Deadites as her minions, and the designs fit really well with the fusing of Henrietta's original iteration and her appearance in the modern TV show. Many of her Deadite minions are intentionally designed to look like characters from the show or the movies. as Deadite Elite, for example, is dressed exactly like Jake from Evil Dead 2. And this basic unit is styled after Cyan Davis's possessed form from the pilot of Ash vs Evil Dead. In many ways, Henrietta represents the game's marrying of the old and the new. She's the same Henrietta that we always knew from the original Evil Dead 2, with a lot of the modernisations and characteristics of her televised reimagining. If you ask me, it might rely a little too much on her appearances in the show, and not having the extended neck really feels like a missed trick, but overall Henrietta is a simple but effective character who's ultimately done justice in the game reasonably well. And before I give my final thoughts, it's time to go briefly over the weapons and other props Evil Dead 2 brought to the game. The double-barrel shotgun, Ash's severed hand, and of course the chainsaw and boomstick. While Ash technically acquired the Knowby Cabin's gun in the first movie, it's originally a single-barreled hunting rifle, and is reworked into a double-barreled shotgun in Evil Dead 2. After a quick appointment with Senor Chainsaw, this shotgun goes on to become the iconic sawn-off shotgun known as the boomstick, in one of the most famous scenes in horror history. It amazes me that there is no version of Ash that has the boomstick as weapon mastery. Evil Dead 2 Ash has the double barrel, and Army of Darkness Ash has the chainsaw, but no boomstick. Maybe they're saving it for Brandy, I'm not sure. But aside from the fairly limited supply of firearms, there's one weapon in particular that's indelibly associated with Evil Dead 2, and is one of the many ways that movie defined the rest of the franchise. Alongside the Necronomicon, Ash's chainsaw arm is probably the biggest symbol of Evil Dead ever, and stands alongside the Texas Chainsaw Massacre as probably the most well-known example of a chainsaw in the history of fiction. It's a core part of Evil Dead 2 as Ash uses it to saw Linda's head in half as an attempt to banish the demon from her corpse, and he later uses it to first cut off and then replace his hand to take on Henrietta and save the day. From Evil Dead 2 onwards, the chainsaw is literally and figuratively a part of Ash, and while he randomly stops using it halfway through Army of Darkness, it's still the defining part of his arsenal for the TV show, and remains the character's most recognisable trait. During his appearance in Evil Dead 2 and subsequent media, the chainsaw itself is a Homelight Super XL. In the original movie, the chainsaw does make a small appearance, but in that iteration it's the Homelight XL12, the first lightweight chainsaw to ever hit the market, and doesn't actually see use or become Ash's hand weapon until Evil Dead 2. I'm not counting the XL12 as the chainsaw's true debut, because it might be a chainsaw, but if it's not on Ash's hand stump, it's not the chainsaw. Speaking of Ash's hand stump, one of the most memorable parts of Evil Dead 2 is Ash's possessed right hand, which attacks him in the first true slapstick scene of the franchise and forces him to cut his hand off at the wrist. But just because it's detached, doesn't mean it's going to stop him in his quest to make its former master's life as irritating as possible, stabbing Annie in the back with the Kandarian dagger at the end of Evil Dead 2, and even going as far as growing a whole second Ash to kill Amanda at the end of the show's first season. Just like how Henrietta fills the role of the generic boss, Ash's hand is the generic chest trap, waiting to deal a decent chunk of damage and fear to any survivor who opens the chest. More than other iterations like the Mini Ash or Possessed Trees, but not enough to be an actual threat on its own. This to me is exactly what Ash's hand should be, an inconvenience that, while mildly irritating, is only a threat to you when you're dealing with something else, and what you really don't want right now is a mischievous undead hand flipping you off. And with Ash's hand, that just about covers everything Evil Dead 2 brought to the game, and my overall thoughts on it are kinda mixed. Aside from the remake that arrived late to the party, Evil Dead 2 had the least representation of any part of the franchise, which is odd given the massive impact it had on the franchise's direction and future. With only 3 survivors, 2 of which did not bring back the original film's cast to voice them, and a demon that arguably owes more to her reappearance in the TV show than she does to her debut in the movie, Evil Dead 2 stands out when compared to the massive amount of love the original Evil Dead, Army of Darkness, and especially the TV show got. Part of this is the source material itself not really having much to adapt. It's tied with the original Evil Dead for having the smallest cast of any installment, and that's assuming you count Ed and Bobby Joe as proper characters, which incidentally I fucking don't. And in a series where each different installment has a radically different tone, Evil Dead 2 kinda suffers from the success of the TV show it inspired. Ash vs Evil Dead is basically a sequel and expansion to Evil Dead 2, except with Ash's characterization taken from Army of Darkness. and because the show's tone was so heavily inspired by Evil Dead 2, it's only natural that the modern retelling kind of steals the show from the original. That's not me knocking Ash vs Evil Dead, but I love that show. It's something that will become clear when I discuss it more in the future. But it's no secret that Evil Dead 2 kinda got the short end of the stick when it came to being adapted into the game. That being said, while Evil Dead 2's characters don't get the greatest showing, it's worth remembering that the game's overall black comedy tone would not be what it is without Evil Dead 2. We can argue all day whether the game's blend of humour and violence comes more from the show or from the films, and I'd argue the show was the game's biggest influence by far, but the show would never even have dared to go into that territory if Scott Spiegel and Evil Dead 2 hadn't delved more into the comedy that would define the franchise's future. Hell, the franchise may not have even had a future if it had stuck with the grim, grindhousey formula the first film had set up. Evil Dead 2 may not have brought all the characters, or the weapons, or the voice cast for Evil Dead the game, but it certainly brought the vibes. That unmistakably cheesy, goofy bloodbath that defines the franchise, and for that it cannot be praised enough. The first 6 months of the game's life cycle has leaned heavily on Army of Darkness to give us post-release content for the game, and it looks like Ash vs Evil Dead is the next up to the plate in the new year. But it remains to be seen if these funny little fellows down at Saber will revisit what is inarguably the most important film in the series someday. Hope you enjoyed today's video on Evil Dead 2. While I've been gone, I've really missed playing Evil Dead and did a full rewatch of Ash vs Evil Dead, and I've been wanting to make this video for ages, so I thought I'd just get it out here now. January is lining up to be a massive month. I've got a lot of videos planned, and if you want to stick around for them, then be sure to subscribe. Links to all my socials are in the description. 2023 looks like a really interesting year, both for Dead by Daylight and Evil Dead, and I can't wait to talk about them. So I guess I'll see you then. Ta-ta for now.